Everybody, Kat here for Lifted Up Today, and we are going to get right into our Matthew 16 study and catch up here. This has been on my heart a lot lately, and toward the middle of the chapter, it's really been on my heart. So we'll get into that in a second. But let's start right away on answering our questions. Number one was kind of like a vague answer, and it was just kind of like all-encompassing for the chapter. Number one was, what were some of the surprises the disciples received? And basically that was kind of like a summary question, I guess, for you to just read through the chapter and kind of come up with your own answer. Basically, some of the surprises that they received were understanding regarding the doctrine of the Pharisees and Sadducees, because they didn't really know what Jesus was talking about when he referred to that. So understanding there, and then also they received revelation of the person of the King, of who Jesus is, revelation of the church, revelation of Jesus' death, and then also the mention of the prophecy of the second coming of Christ. Those were some surprises that may have not really hit them then when it happened, but later on, most definitely, it would have occurred to them how important those things were that were mentioned. So let's get started right away, because we're the number two question is having to deal with the middle of the chapter here. So I kind of want to go through the first so we don't leave anything out. Now, at the beginning of the chapter, there's a debate over a sign from heaven, and the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they're coming again, trying to catch Jesus in doing something wrong. There is a fly in here. If you see him buzzing by, I'm really sorry about that. He's in the window box here, so I'll have to try to get rid of him. All right, starting at verse 1. Then the Pharisees and Sadducees came, testing him, asked that he would show them a sign from heaven. He answered to them, Jesus answered to them, and said to them, When it is evening, you say it's going to be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, it's going to be bad weather, foul weather, for the sky is red and threatening. And then he called them hypocrites. Hypocrites! You know how to discern the face of the sky, but you cannot discern the signs of the times. A wicked and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign shall be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. And he left them and departed. So basically, the Lord was telling these Sadducees and Pharisees that, you can look at the weather and, you can tell what kind of weather it's going to be, but you have all these different signs all around you. I mean, Jesus fulfilled so many, all of the prophecies from the Old Testament, and there were many and many and many, and he fulfilled every single one, which is impossible unless you are who he said he is, unless he really is the Son of God, and he was here to fulfill those prophecies. That's who he was, so he did. And with every single one of those, and the signs and wonders that he performed, the miracles, everything, all of these signs, they should have known who he was, and yet they couldn't discern that. They didn't see it. They didn't want to see it. And it's not, you would think, oh gee whiz, they had, Jesus there in person, and he was doing all this great stuff. How could people not believe him if that's happening right in front of him? Well, there's great things that still happen today, and people still see miracles today. And I mean, there is, and not to mention the miracle of, the Bible itself, of having the Bible, and how that has stayed intact, and just, the whole miracle of that. Even, I mean, there are people there are a lot of Pharisees and Sadducees who are not Jewish, people that just refuse to see and acknowledge who he is. There's a lot of people still like that today, and it's just the hardening of a heart, So anyway, so that's why he called them hypocrites. They weren't very good at discerning, what was really important, and yet they said that they could, tell what kind of weather it was going to be from the signs, and they demanded a sign from him at the same time. With all of these things that he did, healing the sick, raising from the dead, making the blind to see, making the lame walk, forgiveness of sins, everything that he's done. And they said, we want you to prove to us, show us the sign that you are who you say you are. What other kind of sign do they want? And so he says, no other sign is going to be given to you except for what was, for the prophet, the sign of the prophet Jonah. And what he means by that is, now Jonah was in the belly of the great fish for 3 days and 3 nights, right? And so will the Son of Man be. He had said that in other places, and that is what he called himself. Jesus was going to be in the grave for 3 days and 3 nights, just as Jonah was when Jonah was in the belly of the great fish that God had prepared to swallow him for a time. He mentioned that he was in Sheol, or the place of a place of like death, but and so it's kind of the same thing. Jonah didn't die. God kept him alive in the fish, but Christ will die for 3 days, and then he would rise again. And so that's what he's referring to here. But are they going to understand that? Probably not. Now let's go on to verse 5. Now when his disciples had come to the other side, they had forgotten to take bread. This is good. Then Jesus said to them, take heed and beware. Now remember what just happened with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, right? They just had a run-in. And Jesus said, take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And so they didn't know what he meant by that. And all of a sudden they started saying, oh, wait a minute. He's saying that because we forgot to bring bread, isn't he? What is he talking about? Oh, yeah, we're in trouble because we forgot bread again. They didn't really understand what he was saying, and which is odd given the encounter that they just had. But, they're just people, and they're they've misunderstood things before. And so Jesus says, Jesus, being aware of what they're saying, said to them, oh, you of little faith, why do you reason among yourselves because you have brought no bread? Do you not yet understand or remember the 5 loaves of the 5,000 and how many baskets you took up, nor the 7 loaves of the 4,000 and how many large baskets you took up? Remember, we read that last time. How is it you do not understand that I did not speak to you concerning bread, but to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees? Then they understood in verse 12 that he did not tell them to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the doctrine of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So why? Basically, Jesus was warning of the dangerous influence here of that whole, legalistic, hypocritical way that they taught. I'm going to read you this little note here that might help. The most sinister influence of the Jewish leaders was a pragmatic doctrine that made room for hypocrisy. They were too concerned with externals and ceremonies and the way things appeared, and not concerned enough with matters of the heart. And Jesus rebuked them for their hypocrisy again and again. This is probably the 3rd or 4th time we've run into this with the Pharisees and the Sadducees already. At this point in time, and I would think that he probably just had enough of them constantly following after him, trying to, slip him up somehow. And of course, it never works. But they were after him in any case. So let's go on to verse 13 here. When Jesus, this is speaking about the revelation of the person of the King of Jesus. When Jesus came into the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, saying, who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am? And this is huge. This is really, really huge. So they said, some say John the Baptist. Now remember I believe it was our last chapter review when Herod Antipas thought, now he was the one who beheaded John the Baptist, and so when he heard about Jesus coming around, he was kind of afraid that John the Baptist had come back to life to come and get him, basically. And so there were people who followed after that idea that perhaps Jesus was John the Baptist. So that's why they mentioned it here. And he said some Elijah and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. So there were all these different people who were speaking about, whether or not Jesus was one of these other prophets. And there's reasons why they thought so. There were I want to say, local legends that may have pushed people into thinking that way. And and I'm not talking about biblical reason for that, but other things that people had come up with at the time. But he said to them in verse 15, "But who do you say that I am?" And this is really important, because this is a question that you need to imagine that he's not just asking the disciples this, but this is a question that he asks every one of us. He looks into our soul, and at the end of every one of our lives, we all, doesn't matter who you are, you're going to need to answer that question. Who do you say that Jesus is? And that's going to determine your eternity based on who you say he is. And we'll look at why that is in just a second here. I'm going to stop it right here because it's a very important point. I don't want to rush through at the last minute. So come over with me to part 2, and then we'll finish this off. And don't forget, don't go start washing dishes or make yourself a sandwich or something. Come back over and let's finish this study, because I do think that you're going to get a real blessing out of this. So, all right, I love you guys, and I'll see you in a little bit. Don't forget. I'll see you soon. Bye.